So tonight is the inaugural reading of a new program called the Journalist in Residence at Colorado College, funded by a wonderful and generous alum, Ian Griffiths, and Hampton Sides, who you'll hear tonight, who you're all here to hear, is our journalist in residence for the first 2 years, and we're going to keep him busy. He teaches 2 blocks each year. He will teach 2 blocks. He'll spend a 3rd block working with our journalist students and with the students who work for and turn out our Cutler publications on campus. And in addition, he will be responsible for, as is part of the program, a lecture series each year. And he's working hard at that. And in essence, this is the first one, and he gets to do it. And we're very happy that he gets to do it. Let me make sure I'm getting everything right about that. Yes. And for, I forgot. Also part of the series will include another class this year in journalism. Block 6, taught by Peter Breslow, the senior producer of NPR's Weekend Edition, and journalist and reporter extraordinaire, Peabody Award winner, and I believe the former producer of NPR's All Things Considered, the most hyperbolic title of any program I've ever known. All Things Considered, really? I don't believe it. But now he's senior producer of Weekend Edition, and he will be teaching a course in Block 6 for those lucky students who want to sign up for a course titled, appropriately, Radio Journalism. So we're all very, very thrilled to have this new venture at Colorado College, and it promises to be a lot of fun and a lot of good dinners and cocktails or 2 eventually over the years. But tonight, Hampton Sides. Hampton Sides is a resident of Santa Fe, just down the road, and he is a Miller Distinguished Scholar at the Santa Fe Institute and a partner of the Santa Fe-based movie company Atalaya Productions. Did I do that right? Atalaya Productions. So he's very busy anyway. In addition, he is a senior editor of Outside Magazine, one of the premier magazines in American journalism. And he's had many articles published, of course, in Outside. He grew up in Memphis, just a hop, skip, and jump from Faulkner World, Mississippi. And he went to Yale. He's also the father of the guy that just walked in, a CC senior. I can't believe he's a senior. Oh, he's a second semester junior? Oh, okay. No, good. I don't believe he's a senior. Not only can't I don't. And McCall Sides, who is a film and new media major. And so he's here he better be here to see your father. And he's a writer, and a very, very accomplished writer. Among his books are Ghost Soldiers, an account of an amazing rescue expedition in World War II, Blood and Thunder, subtitled Kit Carson and the Conquest of the American West, I believe, which I'm very fond of because I bought my father, was an avid reader, and I bought it for my father, and that was the best gift I ever bought. He read it, and then he picked it up and read it again. And I think it's his favorite book he ever read. He was sort of shocked by what he found there. But I think that's McCall's signature. In the recent review of his new book, from which you'll read tonight, The Kingdom of Ice, the American Scholar a fine, fine journal, says this: Hampton Sides has a gift for breathing new life into the history we thought we knew. And he continues to do this in book after book. His current book, number 3 on the New York bestseller list, that's pretty good to get somebody here, number 3, is The Kingdom of Ice, the grand and terrible polar voyage of the USS Jeanette. And so I'm very thrilled to be able to introduce Hampton tonight, Hampton Sides, who will read from his new book. Hampton?
Thanks, Barry. It's great to be back here. This is fast becoming one of my homes. I taught here last year, and my son goes here, and I'm going to be teaching a little more here. So you're going to see a little bit more of me on campus this year. But it's great to be back and to talk this time about my book. Last time I was here, I did an earlier version of this talk, but the book wasn't out yet, and I was kind of testing the waters a little bit, and so this time the book is out, and I'm in the middle of a book tour right now. This is city number 17 in a 32 city book tour. Next Monday I'll be in New York City at the Explorers Club giving a talk. I think you have to wear a pith helmet to get inside that place, but real pleasure to talk about the book here in one of my homes. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the environment that produced this expedition to the Arctic. But before I do that, I want to ask you guys, and I ask every time I go anywhere, I ask this question. Borrowing those of you who are now reading the book or have already read it, how many of you have ever heard of the voyage of the USS Jeanette? Exactly. That's why I'm here. That's why I wrote the book. It is one of these amazing forgotten stories from the Gilded Age. It was extremely well known in its time. It was a sensation. These men were household names. This voyage was like sending men to the moon or to Mars. And yet, for a variety of reasons, which I'll go into, the voyage has been largely forgotten. The one place in the world where the voyage is not forgotten is the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, where George Washington DeLong, the commander, and his men are celebrated as great exploratory heroes. And there's this Jeanette Expedition memorial on the grounds there overlooking the banks of the Severn River. Also in Woodlawn Cemetery, which is one of the great Gilded Age cemeteries. This is in New York City. And there's a Jeanette memorial there. Otherwise, it's largely forgotten, and that is why I spent nearly 4 years sort of digging this tale out of obscurity. Okay, so the USS Jeanette was trying to get to the North Pole, and they were trying to sail to the North Pole. And so, lest you think all these men were absolutely insane, you kind of have to understand a little bit about the environment of the 1870s and what people thought was up there and what they, what some of the theories were about how you might reach it. There was this ancient idea that was called the open polar sea. This notion that at the top of the world there was a warm body of water, if you could just reach it. And where this idea came from is a kind of a mishmash of myth and legend and rumor and supposed sightings by Arctic whalers, and also this map from the 1590s. This is a Mercator map, which shows very clearly an open polar sea with these 4 symmetrical river systems running through the ice. And if you could reach it, it would be quite a grail for you, for an explorer, for a nation. Once you get an idea like this fixed on the map, especially a beautiful map and an important map that was widely circulated like this one, it becomes really difficult to dislodge it from the public imagination. And so for centuries, throughout the 1600s, 1700s, and into the 1800s, you have a progression of scientists and pseudoscientists who are trying to prove the existence of this thing that no one has seen. It's sort of like proving the existence of God with all kinds of elaborate arguments. The Greeks talked about something called Hyperborea, which was somewhere north of the mountains, beyond the reach of man, that was supposedly a warm place. And also the Vikings had a place called Ultima Thule, which was a sort of a similar idea with various marine creatures and, some sort of oasis beyond the ring of ice, if you could just somehow reach it. During the 1800s, there were also some decidedly wackier ideas, including the ideas of this one guy named John Cleves Symmes, who sold out auditoriums all over the world with his theory of what he called holes at the poles. This notion that there are giant vents at both the North and the South Pole that lead down into the earth where people live, and there's obscure species. And he really tantalized millions of people with his ideas, and even launched an expedition towards the South Pole on the basis of his, we now know, fairly crazy ideas. This was kind of what it was supposed to look like as seen from outer space, these giant vents that let light in, and that these people were just dying for us to somehow find them, reach them, if we could just get through the ice. The idea lives on today, and I was interested when I was doing research for the book to find out that if you just Google holes at the poles, you'll see a very interesting kind of subculture there of people who believe that it's the explanation for UFOs, and that the Obama administration is preventing us from knowing about it. And the idea seems to be deeply embedded in our public discourse. This is from one of those websites. Supposedly a NASA photograph. Maybe it's true. Who knows? Jules Verne, the French novelist, also kind of gave force to the argument of the open polar sea, at least popular force, with the publication of his book, Journey to the Center of the Earth, where he talked about an open polar sea, although he brought it down below ground into these subterranean cavities. He called it the Central Sea. So again, there was just this great desire to believe in this concept, which we, of course, now know to be completely false. So other people are supposed to be up there as well. Jolly people, fat people, and their elves. And I thought this was an ancient idea, St. Nick and his helpers, but it actually has its origins fairly recently in a Thomas Nast cartoon from the 1860s, where he showed Santa and his elves, his helpers, at the end pole, it said. So again, speaking to this desire that we seem to have in the middle part of the 1800s to really believe that there was this sort of oasis at the top of the world. Now, there were a lot of scientists also, or you might say pseudoscientists, who believed in the concept with great conviction. And this was probably the foremost of them. This is a guy named Dr. August Petermann from Gotha, Germany, who was the foremost map maker in the world. He had this huge operation there that published these beautiful, very up-to-date, hand-colored maps that showed the world as it was, but also with these big gaps that drove him crazy. We didn't know what was really going on in the interior of Australia, or the interior of Africa, or the North or South Pole. Dr. Petermann had a lot of theories about especially what was at the North Pole. And it was really on the basis of his ideas and theories that the Jeanette Expedition was launched. Also, like so many people in the Gilded Age and so many people in my book, Dr. Petermann had excellent facial hair. So this is one of his many publications, the Atlas of Physical Geography. These were highly sought after. These maps today are worth a heck of a lot of money on the open market or at auction. His maps are beautiful, beautiful specimens, and the power of maps, especially then, was such that if you made beautiful maps, you kind of earned the right to pontificate about just about any subject, which he certainly did. Probably wasn't the kind of guy you'd want to hang out with and have a beer with. He's very intense, burning intellect, lots of theories. Some of them correct, many of them absolutely dead wrong, as we later learn. I went to Germany to try to find out what I could about Dr. Peterman and his world and his publishing environment there and the maps that he made. Horst Richardson, who's the coach here, the soccer coach, and taught German here for a long time, helped me actually to make some contacts and to kind of burrow into this universe of his, which is fairly forgotten now, but was a really big deal in throughout the middle 1800s. This is his grave in Gotha, his house where he was born and raised. And this begins to show sort of some of his theories of what was up there and why there was an open polar sea. We were just beginning to learn about the power of the Gulf Stream, which brings all this warm water from the tropics north, great power, great velocity to this current. People believe that it kept going north past Norway and that it tunneled under the ice, and it was Peterman who believed that it kept going all the way to the North Pole. And we were also beginning to learn about this other current in the Pacific Ocean called the Kuroshio, which also does more or less the same thing, going north towards the Bering Strait, and ultimately, he thought, tunneling under the ice and converging at the North Pole with the Gulf Stream, creating this great vortex, which would explain the open polar sea, supposed open polar sea. Obviously, completely wrong. Now, one of the great believers in August Peterman's ideas was this guy, the publisher of the New York Herald, which was then the largest newspaper in the world. This was the third richest man in Manhattan, James Gordon Bennett Jr., who had inherited the paper from his dad. He was this outrageous character, spoiled brat, got anything he wanted, did whatever he wanted, and he was fascinated and captivated by the Arctic and wanted to bankroll an expedition to the North Pole. Bennett was a pretty eccentric guy. He had a lot of fetishes and all kinds of eccentric ideas. He was really into Pomeranians and had hundreds of them. He talked to them, interviewed them. He was also into owls. And this is the New York Herald headquarters, and it shows, you'll see, at the parapets there, all those owls looking down on New York. And a lot of people have suggested that James Gordon Bennett was perhaps the model for Bruce Wayne and Batman, because you had this sort of extremely eccentric, aloof, extremely wealthy bachelor who squired a lot of women around and had a lot of irons in the fire, but no one really knew what he was up to, and he had this fetish for nocturnal creatures. Gordon Bennett, a real character, and you can't invent a character like this. If I were to say, write a novel and insert someone like this, I think everyone would say that it was just way over the top. He was a duelist. He urinated publicly in a grand piano at a salon in New York and got himself ostracized from New York society, and ultimately created a whole world for himself in Paris, where he ran his New York paper via the transatlantic cables. He also created something called the why are we doing this? He also created something called the Paris Herald, which eventually became the International Herald Tribune, which still exists. It's sort of the last remnant of his newspaper empire. He was famous as a sailor. He won the first transatlantic yacht race, and he had yachts all over the world, including this one, the Lysistrata, it was called. And it was one of the largest yachts in the world. It was he kept it in the Mediterranean, and it had a Turkish bath, and it also had 2 padded rooms for his dairy cows, so he could have fresh cream every morning for breakfast, for his coffee. So this sort of outrageous influence and wealth being wielded by this one guy, very unpredictable guy, who had various enthusiasms. Of course, I had to go to Paris to, do some research. My wife and I went together and checked out his world. This was one of his many apartments in Paris, his villa in the south of France near Monaco, Boulevard Gordon Bennett. And this was the view from his villa, which we just knocked on the door, and sure enough, someone let us in. Someone's living there now. This is what it looks like inside. This is the fireplace with the owls. The owls are just sprinkled around everywhere. He had them on cufflinks, on stationery. He had live owls, stuffed owls. He was really into owls. He was also really interested in international sports and is considered the father of American polo. He brought polo to the U.S. He brought tennis to the U.S. The very first competition of tennis in the U.S. happened at a place that he built called the Newport Casino, which now is the National Hall of Fame for tennis. If you go to Newport, check it out. So while the men of the Jeanette are struggling in the ice, Gordon Bennett is distracted by tennis and this new sport. Also got later in his life into auto racing and balloon racing. The Gordon Bennett Cup is still the premier international balloon racing event in the world. So that's sort of his legacy. But perhaps what he's best known for is sending this guy, Henry Morton Stanley, to Africa to find Livingstone, who was not exactly lost. He didn't exactly need to be found, but Bennett thought it was a great storyline and would make a great series of dispatches for the paper, and he was not wrong. They were a sensation. They sold out. They led to even more articles by other journalists. It was just this great series, and this is what Bennett was famous for, kind of orchestrating the news or orchestrating events that produced endless copy. And he was looking for an encore to Stanley Livingstone when he came up with this notion of bankrolling an expedition to the North Pole. So he hired this guy, a young naval officer named George Washington DeLong, who was a young, ambitious Naval Academy graduate who had acquitted himself very well in an earlier expedition in Greenland. This guy was obsessed with the North Pole. He wanted to be the first man to reach the pole. He was very thorough. He had read everything about the Arctic. He was desperate to go back. So he eventually got the job, and this very unique kind of hybrid arrangement was formed where Bennett paid for everything, but it was a U.S. naval expedition with U.S. Navy officers sailing under naval rules, and the ship would be an official Navy vessel. This is the ship that was purchased from the British, the Pandora, which became known as the USS Jeanette, named after Bennett's sister, Jeanette. George DeLong and his wife, Emma, and a small crew sailed the vessel from France all the way around the Horn to San Francisco in 1878, where it was massively reinforced for the ice and stuffed with all the latest inventions, an Oregon, Budweiser beer, and all kinds of American inventions, including the lights of the young Thomas Edison, who was still trying to perfect the mechanisms for the lights, but DeLong wanted to light up the North Pole. He had this notion that it would be dark for 6 months of the year, and so it would be, why does it keep doing that? What's the good of that? Anyway, actually Edison's lights were not quite ready for prime time, as we find out, and they kind of flickered and fizzled and didn't exactly work. But also, Alexander Graham Bell's telephones were on board and various telegraph equipment so the men could communicate with each other over the ice. So they left San Francisco in the summer of 1879. 10,000 people were there to see them off. Everyone knew about them. All the papers covered this. It was a really big deal, and they were off to the pole to win this for the United States. And for, this was an interesting time because we had fairly recently purchased Alaska from the Russians, and everyone was deeply curious to know what was just north of our new territory. So that was part of what drove this expedition, was trying to find out what was north of Alaska, also to test this open polar sea theory. So they head north through the Bering Strait, and they're heading generally towards this place in the Chukchi Sea called Wrangel Land, which was a mysterious land at the time. No one had seen it, really. There were just rumors of it, little scraps of rumors from Arctic whalers. No one had certainly landed on it. So that was one of the objectives of the expedition, was to figure out what this Wrangel Land was. They headed north through the Bering Strait and into the Chukchi Sea, where they promptly, in September, became locked in the ice. They did not find this open polar sea. They did not find this current, this warm water current. They, in fact, were locked in the ice for 2 years, drifting constantly, slowly, in a general direction of the North Pole. So for 2 years, they're stuck with each other out on the ice, and they can't really figure out what to do other than develop some sort of routine. DeLong proves to be a very able leader. He keeps everyone extremely busy. They don't exactly suffer during this 2 years. They're kind of going slowly mad from inaction and boredom and too much togetherness. But they're not exactly suffering. You know, I mentioned earlier the organ. They had musicals. They had a little printing press where they printed things. They had readings. This was the Gilded Age. You know, they didn't want to suffer too much. But there were some things that happened during those 2 years. It was kind of interesting from a narrative point of view. I was trying to figure out, how do I cover this 2 years of essentially the same thing, just like every day, month by month, day by day. It's all pretty much the same. And what I ended up doing is doing something from, I guess you'd say, from film, which is a certain point, I end the chapter and there's a new section, and I just say, 1 year later. Because it's exactly the same. Now, there are a couple of little stories that happened during that 2 year period, including this guy, Collins, who is the meteorologist, one of the scientists on board. Great character, great guy, interesting man. But unfortunately, the men found out that he had a propensity for delivering really bad puns. And this kind of wordplay can be fun for a day or two, but 2 years? So everyone's trying to kill Collins by the end of this voyage. There's also Dannenhauer, the navigator, who also a Naval Academy grad, really intelligent guy. Turns out, though, that he had developed earlier in his life, he had contracted syphilis, and it manifested itself in this condition called syphilitic iritis, which required him to undergo multiple operations without anesthesia in the bowels of the ship where there was no light. He could not stand any sort of light. So he had to stay down in the bottom of the ship for the duration of these 2 years, and he had to wear these goggles. And it just sort of says something about this expedition that you have as a navigator, this blind guy. There's also Melville, who ends up being one of the major characters of the story. He's the engineer. He can fix anything. He's said to be distantly related to Herman Melville, and just an amazing guy. Everything starts to go wrong on this ship, and invariably he's the one who gets the call to fix it. So this shows the general drift of the Jeanette during those 2 years. The first year, it's just crazy. It's like this. They go back, forward, back, forward. They almost come back to the place where they started. It wants to do that. Okay. And then the second year, it begins to straighten out, and they're generally heading towards the North Pole. They're at least heading in the right direction. Okay, so for these narrative histories that I do, I like to go to the places whenever possible that I'm writing about. And I wanted to go to the Bering Strait and to Wrangel Island and to Siberia for the book. So I got myself a really bad haircut, and I went to Moscow because unfortunately I couldn't go through Alaska. I found that I needed all these permits, multiple permits, because these are restricted areas and military zones. So all roads led to Moscow. Eventually, after 2 weeks or so, with the help of a a fixer person from National Geographic magazine. I got these permits. We flew east about 10 time zones to Anadyr on the east coast of Siberia, and boarded a Russian icebreaker, which was heading north through the Bering Strait toward Wrangel Island with a crew of scientists, a lot of extreme sort of finicky bird watcher people, and a French documentary crew. So we're heading north. Here I am, and there's America, and I'm just cursing myself, saying, well, why do I have to travel 13,000 miles to look at my own country? Waving at Sarah Palin the whole way. We keep heading north past the Eurasian, the easternmost point of the Eurasian continent, and it's an amazing place. We made various stops. No one is really living there. Very, very isolated. Kind of this austere beauty. We did find one village called Ulen, which the folks there had just killed a whale, and they were having a festival. They invited us into this village, and we spent a few hours there doing tug-of-war games and all kinds of things. But there were these Russian soldiers who really didn't want us there. And after a few hours, they told us in no uncertain terms to leave. So it's all very restricted. This is just taken with an iPhone, so apologize for the quality, but it's not that bad. So we leave because they did have the Kalashnikovs, and they were pretty forbidding-looking weapons. So we left, got back on board the ship, and kept going north, where we very soon thereafter encountered a lot of ice. And of course, you've been hearing a lot about how there's no ice up there during the summer, and that's generally been true. But this particular summer of 2012, in August, there was a record amount of ice in this part of the Chukchi Sea, and for whatever reason. So we were glad we were in an icebreaker as we got thicker and thicker into it. And then we finally got into places where we literally were brought to a standstill and had to back up and ram through it and find another lead. And it was a little unnerving, actually, to be on a ship that's shaking and shuddering and vibrating from all of this collisions with the ice. This one I took from the bow of the ship straight down, as it's sort of smashing into, some of this ice is like 7, 8, 9 feet thick. That's the one that stopped us in our tracks. So I don't pretend for a second that was even a fraction of what sort of the pressure that the Jeanette was feeling and the kind of intensity of their experience. But it did give me some sense of what the environment is like when you're trapped in the ice. Okay, so we eventually did reach Wrangel Island, which is an amazing piece of real estate. It's about 100 miles long. It's called the Galapagos of the High North because it's a very large amount of wildlife, including it's the largest denning ground for polar bear, large population of snow geese and snowy owls and Arctic fox and muskox. So it's just a fascinating place. It's a restricted Russian wildlife preserve. And again, you need a million permits to get there, but we did finally reach it. We left the ship and made landfall on these Zodiac rafts, and just an incredible place. This is a photograph that I took with my iPhone at about midnight. It doesn't get dark during the summer. We finally made landfall and were met by these Russian rangers who were so excited to see us. Human life, fresh blood, these 4 young guys who live there year-round, and that's it on this entire island. So we came aboard, and I should back up and explain that I was doing a story for National Geographic magazine about Wrangel. And there was a guy named Sergei Gorshkov, who's this amazing photographer who has been going to Wrangel for decades, over a decade, taking pictures of wildlife there. And these are pictures of his, some of which ran in the magazine. One of the things he's been documenting is this this phenomenon of these polar bear who normally would be out on the ice during the summer, but generally speaking, the ice has not been reliable. And so they've consequently been coming to the island in large numbers, 30, 40, 50, and congregating like this, which is something they just do not ordinarily do. This is a walrus kill that Sergei photographed. Arctic fox. The fox really collect large numbers of these snow goose eggs for their pups and bury them, and they're constantly fighting with the geese over these eggs. It's sort of about a 50-50 proposition. Sometimes the geese win, sometimes the foxes win. Also, excellent facial hair. So Sergei stays in this ramshackle cabin there that we were very glad that the windows were all covered in these makeshift bear guards. Those are 6-inch nails that were welded to a frame because the polar bear are everywhere. Wrangel Island is also the last place, or believed to be the last place on Earth where woolly mammoths lived. Some 3,000 or 4,000 years after they became extinct on the mainland, they lived on Wrangel. And so consequently, you find these tusks everywhere, all over the place. Sergei snapped this picture with my iPhone, which I tried to get into my carry-on luggage, but it just wouldn't fit. Anyway, Wrangel Island, amazing place. And because it was first landed on, or the party that first landed on it was an American party, it is somewhat controversial. There are people, if you go online, you'll find there's a lot of controversy about who really owns Wrangel Island and whether we should have pressed our case a little more forcefully to call this American territory. Now, the Jeanette Expedition did not land on Wrangel. They tried to land on Wrangel. They were caught in the ice and drifted beyond it and over it, and they could not reach it. But in the summer of 1881, when the Jeanette had not returned after 2 years, a number of other vessels were sent north to try to find the Jeanette. And one of those vessels was the Corwin from San Francisco. They landed on it in the summer of 1881. And on board the Corwin was this guy, the father, really, of the modern American environmental movement, John Muir, who then was a young newspaper reporter from San Francisco who was fascinated by glaciers, and he just wanted to be on board the ship and describe this enormous detective story that they were on the scent of the Jeanette. So he wrote a book that was published posthumously called The Cruise of the Corwin, where he talks about this. So he ends up being one of the major characters in the kind of the middle portion of the book. However, the Corwin and Muir, they find absolutely no evidence of the Jeanette. They cannot find a trace of this vessel. Because the Jeanette at this point was about 1,000 miles to the northwest of Wrangel, still locked in the ice, still fighting this enormous pressure of the ice pack. DeLong begins to realize that the end is coming, and he gets many of his belongings, the belongings that he thinks he'll need, out on the ice, including these 3 whale boats, these open boats, and some food. But he knows that the end is coming and that the ship is going to sink. And it finally does in June of 1881. And the reason we're looking at paintings and engravings is that, unfortunately, all the photographs of the Jeanette Expedition went down with the ship when it sank to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. So, unfortunately, we have no expedition photos. But DeLong and his 33 men and his 40 dogs are stranded out on the ice pack with nothing to do but try to make it to the nearest landmass, which is 1,000 miles away, the central Arctic coast of Siberia. And so this begins one of the great treks, one of the great survival stories, really, of all time, as these guys try to make it to open water and sail to Siberia before winter sets in. This is a image I got from NOAA, which shows where that yellow pin is there, the location. We know the exact location of the Jeanette wreck. It's in about 200 feet of water. It's in Russian waters, unfortunately. One of my great desires is that somehow we could lead an expedition to find the Jeanette and photograph it and maybe bring some things up. You may have heard recently, just in the last few days, that one of the vessels of the Franklin expedition, the British expedition, was just recently found in Canadian waters. So I'm kind of hoping for an encore of that sort of idea, but unfortunately right now, with the geopolitical situation being with what it is, our relationship with Russia is not very good after Crimea and so forth. So it may be put on hold for a little while. Anyway, that's where the Jeanette sank. And thus begins this great trek of hauling these belongings. Everyone's in harness. They're just working, sometimes 24 hours a day, struggling over the ice, trying to get to open water. And DeLong holds this expedition together extremely well. There is no mutiny, even though it tries to rear its head every now and then. It's extremely well organized, and they do work their way south. However, one of the things that DeLong has to do is figure out what about these logbooks, because he had been taking incredible notes and meticulous weather logs of the whole 2 years they were stuck in the ice. But these logs are extremely heavy. They're folio-sized books. I saw them at the National Archives and used them. And the entire time he's thinking, I got to chuck these. But he says if I do, then there may be no evidence ever that this expedition even happened. So they become like religious relics to him. And so the whole story of the Jeanette is really based on these logbooks that were dragged over the ice and across the open water and eventually made their way to National Archives. So during the summer of 1881, Emma DeLong is still wondering, of course, where her husband is, and she is in New York waiting for his arrival, hoping for good news. And I show this picture of her in part because I had this experience early on during the research for the book, which is kind of a dream of historians, which is this notion that you find a distant relative, you call them up, you ask them, do they have anything on the relative, and like, well, yes, I do. I have this trunk full of old letters up in the attic, and I don't know what to do with it. Will you please take it off my hands? I've never had that even remotely happen to me before. Of course, I flew immediately to her house in Connecticut. This was a woman named Catherine DeLong, and they proved to be the personal papers of Emma DeLong, the wife of the commander. And one of the great things in that trove that I found was she wrote these letters that she called her letters to nowhere, which were letters that she copied in triplicate, and she sent north via these Arctic whaling ships in the hope that somehow, some way, they would reach him. And she wrote beautiful, elegant letters. First, very calm, but as the summer progressed, they become more and more worried and more desperate, and they become quite heartbreaking when you kind of cut back and forth between her letters and what the men are actually experiencing out on the ice. Okay, so this shows the drift of the Jeanette at the very beginning. The cross is where the Jeanette sank, and you notice that they go north for a little while, and that's not because DeLong was disoriented. It's because they found out after an entire week of just endless struggle, this big push over the ice, they found out that the ice itself was drifting faster towards the north than they were moving south. So they were actually going backwards. And this was the low moment of the expedition when DeLong realized this. But things kind of turned around and they began to work their way south. Along the way, they discovered 3 islands and explored one of them, Bennett Island it's called, named after the publisher, and kind of licked their wounds there and kind of regrouped because they were nearly starving to death, and eventually found open water and began to work their way towards Siberia. They're still called the DeLong Islands to this day. They're now part of Russia as well, and also somewhat disputed by certain groups who think they should be rightfully American soil. So they reach open water and begin to sail, or they start to sail, only to find out that banging and dragging and sliding these boats over the ice had nearly ruined them, and they weren't seaworthy. So Melville, to the rescue, he comes in and basically with some walrus bone and various pieces of driftwood is able to repair these vessels and at least make them somewhat seaworthy. So they set sail, but the second day they encounter an enormous gale which separates the 3 boats. And the story at this point becomes the story really of the very different fates of these 3 boats as they try to reach Siberia. And this is kind of the point in the story where I begin to get a little vague because I really think that the last 100 pages of the book is, these pages are much more powerful and haunting and meaningful, I think, if you don't know what happens. You can Google it if you really want to, or you can just read the New York Times book review, which ran 2 weeks ago and pretty much just told the entire plot of the story, whatever. So they make their way towards this enormous delta of one of the world's largest rivers, which is called the Lena. And this is what it looks like from space. It's an enormous place, larger than the Everglades. And it's hundreds of islands and oxbow lakes and back channels. And this is where they made landfall, trying to find each other, also trying to find civilization, some native settlement where they could, where they'd be saved. And obviously, it is not the kind of place that you'd really want to be wandering, especially as winter is beginning to come on. Because one of the things that happens with the Lena, because it empties into the Arctic, it freezes first at its delta, and it creates this enormous ice barrier, which prevents the current from basically reaching the sea. So the river current just spreads out in this exaggerated delta pattern. And so depending on where you made landfall, these different boats of the three different groups have very different experiences. Okay, so I wanted to go to the Lena Delta as well because I had heard that there was a place somewhere deep in the delta that was called America Mountain. And I thought it was just kind of curious. 400 miles north of the Arctic Circle, in the middle of nowhere in this wilderness, there was a place called America Mountain where I had heard there was a monument to the Jeanette Expedition. So I went to this place, which is called Tiksi. It's the only town of any size. It's a military installation, almost completely abandoned now from the Cold War days, where I'd heard that I needed to get some more permits. They like permits in Russia. So I went there. There's lots of, kind of sketchy characters walking around in Tiksi. But I did get the permits that I needed, and I found, this is Main Street, Tiksi. I had to stay there for about 10 days, just sitting there doing nothing really, but drinking vodka and, just waiting for something to happen. But I did find these 2 guys who had a riverboat company which was contracted by the government to kind of keep the main channels of the Lena River open for the big barge traffic. And it was sort of like a, kind of like the Siberian version of Mark Twain and the Mississippi River or something. So they said for a small price of a bunch of vodka, $2,000 and 10 cartons of cigarettes, I could come aboard their ship, or it's a medium-sized riverboat, and they knew about America Mountain. They had the captain said he knew where it was. It would take about a week to reach it. It was on the far side of the delta, and so I came aboard, worked on this ship. I worked in the galley, and I actually had a ball. This was the part of the trip that was a lot of fun, and was doing this really for the book, but also for an article I was writing for Outside Magazine about the Lena, this amazing wilderness. And this was the last village we called at. There's no infrastructure there. I mean, it's just really, really remote, really desolate. This was a former Soviet weather station. And then finally, we kind of dropped into this wilderness where we didn't see a soul for most of the time we were there. And we did reach, we could see in the distance, America Mountain, this high place in this mostly lowland marsh area. They say there's 2 seasons in this part of Siberia. There's winter, and then there's mosquito. We were there during mosquito. So we reached it, but the ship could go no further. It ran aground, so we got in a little boat and got a little closer, and then it ran aground, and then we got into a raft, and then we finally started wading and splashing across these labyrinths and swatting mosquitoes the whole way until we finally got to the base of this. It's really just it's a hill, basically. It's not a real mountain. But we worked our way up, and sure enough, there was this place, America Mountain, and this Jeanette Memorial monument that was more or less left the way it had been from the 1880s. This was my guide, Andre. He was a former Russian soldier. He's enjoying some of the cigarettes that I gave him. And we paid our respects to the men of the Jeanette. At the bottom of this obelisk here, there's a little box. And in the box, there was all these sort of trinkets and relics that had been left by visitors over the years. All the visitors had been Russian. And in fact, in Russia, the Jeanette Expedition is reasonably well known. But there was nothing from Americans. And there was also money, airplane bottles of vodka, and little trinkets to the men of the Jeanette. So I just so desperately wanted to get to this place. It took forever. It took a lot of money. It took a lot of time, but finally found this place. And as far as I know, no American has been there since the 1880s. Okay, so now Bennett got his story in the pages of the Herald, and then some. This was a bigger story, really, than Stanley Livingston. It was a story that just kept producing more and more and more copy. And he paid for everything. He paid for all these rescue vessels, but he still made out like a bandit on this tale. It was extremely well known in its time. It was the subject of best-selling books, and tons of articles. The men who came back to New York were greeted as great heroes. They were almost viewed as like astronauts of their time. There were huge parades in New York City. DeLong and his journals were published in the form of a best-selling book, The Voyage of the Jeanette. And yet it's almost completely forgotten. Melville, the great character that I talked about earlier, went on to have an amazing career in the U.S. Navy and ultimately became the chief engineer of the entire Navy and is extremely well known in Navy circles. So that's the background on the story of the Jeanette, the environment that produced it, some of the characters. It's a story that's kept me busy for a long time, and I'm just really pleased to be able to kind of now tour the country and talk about it. It's doing extremely well. People are responding to it very well. It's been on the list now, I think, New York Times bestseller list for 5 weeks. And we're now, I think we're number 3. So I think Dinesh D'Souza, who's kind of a right-wing polemicist, is number 1. We're trying to knock him off his pedestal, but we'll get there. But that's the background on this story. I wanted to open it up a little bit briefly and hear from some of you about how I do these stories, why I do them. I don't know how much time, Barry, how much time we have, maybe 10 minutes, something like that. I'd love to hear from you guys. There's also some of my students. I see some of my students here. It's nice to see them. But I'd love to hear from you. Any questions? Well, how did you stumble on the topic in the first place? Well, how did I stumble on the topic? I kind of go back and forth. I feel like there's kind of this semi-permeable membrane between journalism and the historical books that I do. And in this case, it came from a magazine piece that I was assigned for National Geographic to write about a Norwegian explorer. They sent me to Oslo to write about this guy named Dr. Fridtjof Nansen, who aboard this vessel called the Fram, and this is the Fram Museum, he tried to reach the North Pole, essentially trying to duplicate the voyage of the Jeanette. At the Fram Museum, you'll see all kinds of references to George the Long and the Jeanette voyage. And I thought, well, wait a minute, that's an American voyage. I've never heard of it. Why not? And I just kind of filed that away and came home and began to dig into it and found out that it had all this amazing primary documentation that it hadn't been written about in a long time and not very well. And I decided this is a keeper. So that's kind of how it all started. Sorry? Well, that trip was about 4 years ago, a little more than 4 years ago. And I didn't immediately jump into this book, but, this whole process took about 4 years, yeah. Yeah. So why is this one lost in the annals of American history? It was front page news for long periods of time. We had glorious response to all. How did it disappear? Why did it disappear? Why did it go into obscurity? It's a good question. I don't know the exact answer, but I think that one of the reasons is we like triumphs. We like winners in American history, and eventually we did reach the North Pole with Perry, and I think it sort of became overtaken by Perry and some of the other polar tales. That's one thing. Also, I think the fact that all those photos went down with the ship is a big thing, because we're a very visual culture and we like to see these things in vivid terms. And so you take an expedition like the Shackleton expedition towards the South Pole. They had amazing photos which were preserved, and one of the reasons we know so much about that expedition is because of those pictures. The British don't seem to have as much of a problem with sort of mythologizing and romanticizing their noble failures in the polar regions, whether it's the Franklin expedition or Shackleton or a lot of others. So that's part of it, I think, is that something about our culture was like, if you're not first, you're last. And this one was kind of viewed, not at the time. At the time, it was not viewed as a failure at all. They did not reach the North Pole, but they shattered a whole bunch of crazy theories. They proved that Wrangel Land was an island, not a continent, which was one of the theories. They took all these amazing measurements of the Arctic. They sailed across more than 1,000 miles of the planet that had never been seen before by man, and 13 of the 33 men made it home. So it was viewed at the time as not necessarily a failure. But anyway, that's some of the reasons anyway. I don't fully understand it, though. I think it's also just a question of which writers came along to write about it. There were a lot of books right then in the 1880s, and then it just was never really written about again much. Although Orson Welles did a national radio broadcast of the Jeanette voyage on one of those CBS radio or whatever. This was in the 1930s. So it's kind of come and gone in our culture, and it hopefully seems to be coming back in some sort of way. So, yeah. In the back. So you're talking about my research, that I was isolated? Oh, you mean? Oh, yeah. Well, we were there for a while, and we camped out. And those pictures, by the way, were taken like at 3 in the morning. And it was just light, 24/7 at that time. There's something about the grandeur, of that wilderness. It's just so huge, and it just feels like this, like Pleistocene tundra. It's permafrost. Nothing really grows there, and it seems a landscape more fitted for, woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and, than people really. And it's kind of fascinating to go to a place that's that huge and that wide open and not see a soul for so long. But as far as the isolation is concerned, I'm not really one of those writers who needs to write alone. I actually go to coffee shops in Santa Fe where I live, and also here in the Springs when I'm here. I need the noise. I need constant low-level chaos. I don't know why that is. It's kind of strange, but I like a noise. I like caffeine, and I like good Wi-Fi, and so that's where I tend to write. And I think it's because it sort of reminds you when you're in the coffee shop and you're hearing all this noise that this is a public act. You know, that you're writing for an audience, and you need to be reminded that there are people out in the world. Otherwise, you kind of go. I go all sort of Jack Nicholson and just want to kill someone. You know, if I'm at a retreat by myself for very long, a few days is fine, but you know, not weeks. But that's a good question. Everybody has to find their kind of writing, their optimum writing environment, and that seems to be mine. Yes, sir. How are you? How do they get home? Well, I could say, you know, you just read the book. Unfortunately, there was a glitch, and the books are not for sale tonight. The bookstore is playing catch-up because, I mean, probably a lot of you, the students here, may know there's been some problems apparently with getting books. So I can't really say read the book because it's not here to be sold. But I'll tell you just the broad outlines. Some eventually work their way deep into that delta and are saved by a tribe that's called the Yakuts. They're sort of they look like Mongols. They're related to the Mongols, but they speak this language which is Turkish. They can go to Istanbul and be understood. The whole Russian nation kind of ultimately embraces them, brings them to Yakutsk, and then this place called Irkutsk, and then finally by train to St. Petersburg, where they're greeted by the Tsar, and they steam their way home. So that's generally how it worked. But DeLong had buried his logs and journals in the sand in the delta because he, at one point when they were really beginning to starve and suffer from frostbite and so forth, he just realized he didn't have enough energy to carry it any further. So a Navy expedition went back several years later and found those logs and dug them up and sent them by reindeer team and dog team to the railhead and finally to St. Petersburg. So that's part of this. When you think about the voyage that the documents made just to reach us is a big part of this story. That's the broad outlines. I don't want to probably tell you much more, but there's a lot of near misses and almosts and twists and turns because winter is coming on fast, and they very nearly, could have all died. It's kind of a miracle that any of them made it home. Let's have maybe two more or something like that. Hannah, how are you? Good. Thanks.
So of those 4 years since you got the idea, about how many of those were spent researching and how many spent writing, or what you had to do simultaneously?
Writing versus researching. I kind of use research as an elaborate form of procrastination because I love to research. I love to travel. I love to go to the archives. I love to read. I hate to write. At least that first draft. It's painful. I go into this place that I call the Pain Cave, which is a dark place. It's a place of bad hygiene. I shamble about the place and mutter things, and it is painful, just as it is, I think, for all of us. Like writing that first draft, it doesn't get any easier for me anyway. But I think it's about 3/4 research and 1/4 writing. I tend to write really fast because maybe it's my magazine background or my sense of deadlines or whatever, so I do write fast. So it's about 3 to 1, that kind of ratio. But what I don't do, which I used to do, is I used to kind of research and research and research and research, and then stop and then do all the writing. Now I try to research a little bit and write a little bit, research a little bit and write a little bit. So I kind of know where I stand. It's a pretty dangerous proposition to go that far without having written anything, deep into the project, and you still don't have a single word on the page. It's kind of scary. So I have gotten better about that, and I highly recommend it. Write as you go. Yeah. Anybody else? Oh, yeah. Hi.
Since this was kind of post-Civil War, and then refresh me with kind of this expedition function as sort of a reunification, nationalism type effort.
Very much so. The question was about the Civil War and kind of how did that play into all this. We were emerging, from the devastation of the Civil War, and the idea of reaching the pole first was something that sort of North and South could agree on. It was something the Navy wanted to do. It was a nationalistic effort in the sense that we were competing against the British and the French and the Scandinavian countries and a lot of other nations that were all in this fight to reach the pole first. So it kind of had this quasi-military quality to it, but also doing it for science and for national glory and personal glory. But it also had this manifest destiny aspect because we'd kind of reached the West Coast, and the westward push kind of took a right turn and headed for Alaska. We had purchased Alaska from the Russians, and so this was kind of an extension of manifest destiny, I think a lot of people feel. I feel. So that's kind of, the larger environment of all of this. But very much so, there was a race, a polar race, and the British pretty much had done all the best explorations at that point. The Scandinavian countries were also quite good at it and were showing that they would really excel at it. But the United States had gotten into that game as well. So, yeah, my pleasure. Thank you guys for coming. What a pleasure.